How America's history of racism shaped black economics today. The United States has a long and complicated history when it comes to issues of race and inequality, particularly as they relate to economics and wealth. Throughout this history, American policies and practices have contributed to the creation of a significant racial wealth gap, in which black Americans have disproportionately less wealth and economic opportunity than their white counterparts. This gap has deep roots in the nation's history and has been reinforced by a variety of factors, including land acts, laws, and propaganda. One of the earliest examples of this is the Homestead Act of 1862. This policy granted settlers up to 160 acres of public land in areas such as the Great Plains, the Midwest, and the West Coast, ostensibly to encourage westward expansion and settlement. However, it had significant implications for black Americans, who were largely excluded from its benefits. The land grants were often distributed in ways that excluded black people, such as through discriminatory application processes or by limiting the availability of land in areas where black people lived. As a result, black Americans were largely unable to take advantage of this policy and were left behind as white Americans were able to build wealth through land ownership. Other land acts, such as the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 and the Morrill Act of 1862, also had significant implications for land ownership and wealth accumulation in the United States. The Pacific Railroad Act granted over 170 million acres of public land to railroad companies for the construction of a transcontinental railroad, while the Morrill Act granted public land to states for the establishment of public universities focused on agricultural and mechanical education. Both of these acts were distributed in ways that largely excluded black Americans and contributed to the consolidation of land ownership and wealth by white Americans. In addition to land acts, a variety of laws and policies were also used to reinforce racial economic inequality in the United States. Black codes were laws that were passed in many southern states after the Civil War to restrict the rights and freedoms of black Americans. These laws often included provisions that limited black Americans' ability to own land or engage in certain types of economic activity, further exacerbating the racial wealth gap. Propaganda and media also played a significant role in shaping American attitudes toward race and economics. For example, the Lost Cause myth was a popular narrative in the South after the Civil War, which romanticized the Confederacy and downplayed the role of slavery in the Civil War. This myth helped to perpetuate racist beliefs and attitudes, and contributed to the development of a culture of white supremacy that persists to this day. So, how has this history of economic inequality and racial injustice shaped the current state of black economics in the United States? According to data from the U.S. Census Bureau, as of 2019, the median household income for black Americans was $45,438, compared to $68,703 for white Americans. Additionally, black Americans are significantly less likely to own homes, with a home ownership rate of 44% compared to a rate of 74% for white Americans. The racial wealth gap is even more pronounced when considering assets such as stocks, retirement accounts, and other investments, with white Americans having significantly more wealth than black Americans. The racial wealth gap has significant implications for intergenerational mobility, or the ability of individuals to move up the economic ladder from one generation to the next. According to a recent study by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, intergenerational mobility is significantly lower for black Americans than for white Americans. The study found that while white Americans have a 50% chance of moving up from the bottom fifth of the income distribution to the top 3/5, blacks have less than a 20% chance. Another policy solution that has been proposed to address the racial wealth gap is a federal job guarantee. This would ensure that all Americans, including black Americans, have access to meaningful employment opportunities that pay a living wage. By guaranteeing employment, the government could provide a stable source of income and benefits for workers, while also investing in public goods and services that benefit the broader community. This approach has been championed by advocates of modern monetary theory, MMT, who argue that the government can fund such programs without relying on tax revenues or borrowing. There are, of course, critics of these policy proposals. Some argue that reparations would be too expensive or difficult to implement, while others argue that a federal job guarantee would be too costly and could lead to inflation. These concerns are not unfounded, and any policy proposal must be carefully designed and evaluated to ensure that it is effective, efficient, and equitable. However, it is clear that the status quo is not working, and that bold action is needed to address the racial wealth gap and promote economic justice. In addition to policy solutions, there are also many grassroots and community-based initiatives that are working to promote economic empowerment and wealth creation among Black Americans. From community development corporations to credit unions to worker cooperatives, there are many innovative models for community-based economic development that prioritize community ownership, democratic decision-making, and equitable distribution of wealth. Black Americans have a long and proud history of entrepreneurship and economic success, and there is much to learn from the experiences of Black-owned businesses and organizations. However, it is clear that these successes are often achieved in spite of, rather than because of, the broader economic and political context in which they operate. Addressing the racial wealth gap will require not only individual effort and ingenuity, but also systemic and structural change. The racial wealth gap in the United States is a complex and deeply rooted problem that requires a multifaceted response. It is the result of a long history of economic exclusion and discrimination, as well as ongoing systemic and structural factors that perpetuate inequality. Addressing this problem will require a range of policy solutions, as well as community-based initiatives that prioritize economic empowerment and community ownership. By working together to promote economic justice and create a more equitable society, we can ensure that all Americans, regardless of race, have the opportunity to thrive and prosper.